Okay. Uh, Thanks for taking the time to listen to my talk today. My name is Jamal Williams, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about how auditory context and auditory information might alter visual perception. And I think this is particularly interesting because we know visual perception is hard. Prior knowledge and concurrently available information are utilized and integrated to facilitate this computational burden of visual perception. So, for example, like prior experience with priests in churches leads to more accurate target object detection in congruent scenes compared to incongruent scenes. And this facilitation by concurrently available information isn't limited to unimodal sources. So, for example, hearing the sound of a dog has been shown to facilitate recognition compared to hearing the sound of, say, a motorcycle, for example. And we've previously shown that when participants hear real world sound, like a bird song, and need to identify and discriminate a visual object in noise, for a 2AFC task at the end, they're faster at accumulating that visual information for congruent in blue compared to incongruent or random real world sounds. And while previous work can show that visual perception is faster and or more accurate when presented with congruent auditory information, to date, it's unclear what's actually happening to the perceptual representation itself. So it could be that sounds simply accelerate relevant perceptual mechanisms, thus leading to a more rapid, congruent perception compared to an incongruent one. But it could also be the case that sounds alter how incoming sensory information is interpreted, thus resulting in distinct perceptual representations depending on the relationship between the audiovisual information. And so while our project overall is interested in investigating both of these questions, today I'm just going to talk about the perceptual one. And to put this sort of idea into a little bit more of a concrete example, I have a video here for you. And so here, this visual information is slightly imperfect. The object is not only far away, but it's small, so it compounds that shortcoming. But the auditory information that I played was clear, unambiguous, and even provided independent information about the visual object. But what if I played this sound? Was your perception perhaps more drone-like in this example than when the seagull was heard? So maybe your perceptual representation upweighted the flatness of the tail or the sleekness of the body, as opposed to the feathers in the first example. And so to investigate whether sounds shift the perceptual representation of visual objects, we needed stimuli that continuously varied along some continuum. And so one of the cool things that I think we did is that we built a novel stimulus set. We took two silhouettes of relatively real world objects and put 100 steps in between them. So we morphed these dominant features from fully like object A to fully like object B. And we also found and created sounds that matched up with the objects at the end of each continua and did this for several uh, different items, for example, like a goat turning into a Vespa or a hammer going into a seal. And so the second important and potentially interesting aspect of the paradigm is that we implemented a visual discrimination task like the one that I showed before. And so here, a target object fades in through noise. And what I think is really cool about this is it allows us to almost slow down perceptual processing and to correlate response time with object clarity. And it also lets us investigate the ongoing perceptual processing of visual information. By letting us slow down visual perception, it allows us to take advantage of a critical component of auditory information, its temporal component. And it also allows us to understand how people might integrate clear auditory and noisy visual information. And so we integrate these two things into a relatively simple task. And here, participants are going to hear a sound at the beginning of each trial. And then about 500 milliseconds later, a visual discrimination task is going to begin. And here, participants just need to press a button as soon as they feel like they have enough visual information to complete, to accurately report the item in the continuous report task at the end. We give them feedback every trial because we want them to have highly accurate reports. And so, as I said, at the beginning of each trial, participants are going to hear a sound that could be related to objects on the continuum in one of three ways. It could be related to object A on the left side or the low numbers of the continuum, object B, like the bird here, or it could be completely unrelated real-world sound, like the sound of a frog. Another thing the stimulus set lets us do is it allows us to vary the dominant features of target items. And so we selected varying morphs along the continuum so that the sounds were not only not predictive of which visual target might appear, but also not of the dominant visual features that were apparent. And I just have one quick trial to show of the experiment. Yeah, here we go. And this will just loop one more time. Cool. So now we get a feeling for the task. On the right, I'm showing a response error centered around the error from the target, whatever target was shown. And then on the left here, I'm showing an example target. And just to give you an example of how we generate this data, if participants got this target, for example, on a trial and reported this item that was more like object B, it would be represented positively. Whereas if they were reported like object A, we would report it negatively. And so while the error looks really good, participants were overall quite tight in their errors and under the requested amount. What we're really interested in here is how sounds might affect response reports in comparison to a neutral baseline. And so I can show that here. We have the report errors separated by whether participants heard sound A related to the lower side of the continuum related to object A, or sound B. And while we have this data, we're not necessarily interested in categorizing or understanding the exact distributions here. We use the continuous stimuli so that we could vary dominant features in the target task, and we always intended to collapse across this data. And so I can do that now. And I can show you that on the x-axis, when participants heard sound A, they reported items that were visually more similar to object A, and the same is true for sound B. And this effect is not limited to collapsing across all of the items. While we did use 3 different target morphs per continua, we always intended to collapse across them. But looking at this data, we can see that the effect is relatively consistent irrespective of whether the target item's dominant features are more like object A. So here I'm showing the dominant visual features of the target. They could be more object A-like, more balanced, like an equal mix, or more B-like. And these results demonstrate that response error is in the direction of the sound's position on the continuum, suggesting that perceptual representations are shifted towards the identity of the sound. And these data suggest that sounds shift responses away from the responses on neutral trials. So for example, if participants saw this item on a neutral trial, they'd respond with very low error. And then when they saw this same visual object and they reported it as more similar to object B when sound B was heard and more like object A when sound A was heard, even though their error was quite low, irrespective of the condition. We also have actually replicated this effect in another experiment. So we're confident that this effect is real and robust and replicable. But next, we're going to investigate some of the other potential contributing factors. So we suggest that sounds are influence ongoing perceptual processing by affecting how the visual ambiguity and the noise are dealt with alongside the clear and unambiguous information. But still, it could be that sounds aren't exerting influence over visual processing directly, and instead that other cognitive processes are doing the influence, or perhaps even uniquely drive the effect. And so it could be a post-perceptual effect like response bias, where sounds instead influence decisional processes once processing is complete. Or it could be pre-perceptual, where sounds prepare the visual system and induce top-down mechanisms that subsequently influence perception. And so first, we're going to investigate these post-perceptual processes. And so whether sounds induced a post-perceptual effect could have multiple mechanisms. For example, it could be something as simple as participants just reporting the identity of the sound. Or slightly more complicated, that they're trying to communicate that they're not certain of the target's exact identity, but are nevertheless considering all of the available information in their responses. And so we more or less directly test this post-perceptual hypothesis by presenting sounds when they should have the greatest impact over decisional processes during the continuous report task. And so participants hear the sounds after performing visual discrimination. And what we find is that sounds have a limited, if not a null effect over responses, such that they're not significantly pulled away from neutral. And we can compare this effect to what we saw in experiment 1 and see just the drastic difference in size. And this isn't a difference in overall error as well. The error across these two trials, these two experiments, excuse me, are almost exactly the same. We do this within subject, where we show them the blocked sounds coming during the continuous report task or during the visual discrimination task, and we again replicate both effects. We also look at the pre-perceptual version and what we where attention might be inducing these effects. So previous work has shown that using verbal labels well before the presentation of a target can facilitate recognition. And so we're going to use similar timing and a similar task design where sounds are played well before that. And so here participants are going to hear a sound prior to the visual discrimination task, giving them time to prepare or set up these attentional templates. And this should influence primarily top-down processes well before perception begins. And again, we find that this does not influence responses in a significant way. Again, we can compare that to experiment 1's data, and again see that their overall error is very similar to each other, between about 0.1 or 0.2 steps of error. And so this data suggests that the timing of the audio-visual events is a critical factor, similar to previous multisensory work, and that attention is not the primary driver of the effect that we're observing here. And so what I've shown you today is that when participants integrate audio information simultaneously, the report error is shifted towards audio-visual object identity, suggesting that the sounds influence ongoing perceptual processing of new visual information. We then explored pre- and post-perceptual factors that might have significantly contributed to the effect, and we found that post-perceptual nor pre-perceptual processes were largely responsible for the effect. And so what I'd like to leave you with is that we believe that real-world sounds influence ongoing perceptual processing, such that the perceptual representation is shifted towards related visual features. Thank you.